Joseph Banks was a member of the English landed gentry. He owned extensive estates in Lincolnshire, he owned homes in London, he was educated at Harrow School and at Eton College and then at Oxford University. And it was at Oxford where he started to develop a keen interest in natural history.
He threw himself into the study of natural history, particularly botany. It just did something to him that nothing else, including his money, wouldn't do.
Many of those plants that we associate with English gardens today were introduced into Britain, in part through the efforts of Joseph Banks.
Only a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the world's naturalists ever got on a ship, and Banks was one of them.
So Banks has been called many things: dictator of British botany, autocrat of the philosophers, centre of calculation. And I think all of those tend to reflect the fact that Banks was a key figure in the development of British botany, British natural history, in that period from his return from the Endeavour voyage in 1771 until his death in 1820.
Anyone who works in the history of natural history, certainly in the 18th century, but also for several decades in the 19th century, will come across the name of Joseph Banks. He's a towering figure, and his toweringness continues beyond his death in 1820. So I first came across Joseph Banks when I was doing a book about a scientific voyage to Australia and New Guinea, which was in 1850. And even though Banks had been dead for 30 years, he was definitely on the ship. I mean, his spirit was everywhere, and I could feel it, and I had to try to understand what was it about this person that made him so omnipresent. I worked out that it was his own experiences when he was young which made the British naval establishment understand that they needed to have scientists on board, that in addition to making charts and surveys of coastlines, that there was a question of scientific knowledge that went hand in hand with geography. And Banks was responsible for that. And that went back to the first major voyage, scientific voyage he himself was on. Joseph Banks was born in 1743, so right in the middle of the 18th century, and he came from a very wealthy family. His father owned a lot of land in Lincolnshire, and his uncle owned land in Derbyshire and in one or two of the adjoining counties. And that, had that been it, that's all you would have known about him, that he was a wealthy man. But Banks, at some point, and it probably began when he was a child, and certainly was really established during his time at Oxford as an undergraduate, was an incredible love for natural history. It just obviously did something to him that nothing else, including his money, wouldn't do. He threw himself into the study of natural history, particularly botany, because this was the moment of the Linnaean revolution. The revolution in the way in which botanists thought about plants and where they belonged and what families they were in. And Linnaeus was instrumental in creating a new sense of order based on the sexual nature of plants. So it's a little risque if you say it that way, but that's what it was. So Banks left Oxford without a degree and came to London in order to be close to the British Museum. Now the British Museum at the time, so we're talking in the 1760s, early 1760s, had just opened its doors, and the core of its collection was the collection that had been put together by Sir Hans Sloane. And Sloane was a naturalist, just like Banks wanted to be. And so Banks kind of was in his shadow, if you see it. I mean, he went to the British Museum and he'd been completely surrounded by the enormity of Sloane's collection, which included books and drawings and a fantastic herbarium. And while he was there, Daniel Solander came into town, invited by a very well-known English botanist called John Ellis, to bring the Linnaean system to Britain. And Solander was one of Linnaeus' students. So you have this incredible moment where you have a disciple, as he was called, of Linnaeus, working in the British Museum, cataloging Sloane's collection at the same time as the young Joseph Banks is sitting there trying to absorb all of this information as much as possible. And again, we may not have heard much more about him, but then life changed. And the first thing that happened is he went on a voyage on a ship called HMS Niger, which was going to what is presently Newfoundland and Labrador. Only a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the world's naturalists ever got on a ship, and Banks was one of them. So this was in 1766, so he was 23 years old. So that was his first real hands-on experience. And that in itself would have given him a footnote in a book on the history of natural history. But then it just got better for him. 2 years later, in 1768, he was already a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was well known as one of the major lights in the botanical circles in London, especially a committed Linnaean and friends of Linnaeus's disciple, who was based in London. And at that point, Banks goes from footnote into a paragraph. But in 1768, the Royal Society, with the help of the king, agreed that they should send a ship to the Pacific to track the path of Venus. And that they knew would happen on a particular day in July, I think it was 1768. And on that day, that ship had to be there. And that place was the island of Tahiti. Now, the ship, which is HMS Endeavour, was commanded by Lieutenant James Cook. And Cook, who was a brilliant navigator, found Tahiti without passing by it, without making any errors, and was able to be there exactly on the day he had planned from London, months and months and months before. Now, Banks and Solander and his artist, Sidney Parkinson, did what they wanted to do, which is to collect plants and see what the botanical landscape was like. The three of them were a kind of a fantastic unit because there were two botanists, one of whom knew Linnaeus's ordering offhand without even thinking about it, the other one who was learning it, and an artist who is following Linnaean's principles. And they start collecting plants, which is what they'll be doing as the voyage continues. And the voyage continues because Cook has been given a set of instructions which he's not to open up until he has finished tracking the Venus through the skies. And he opens it up and it basically says, you should go and find the southern continent. Unfortunately, the artist, Sidney Parkinson, who had produced a lot of drawings, died on the way home, very young man. And Banks and Solander came back with, I think the estimate is around 30,000, perhaps 40,000 plant specimens, a lot of which had been drawn, a few of which had been colored, in other words painted, on the voyage, but there was a lot to be done. And all of this ended up in Banks's home just down the road here in Piccadilly, where he was living at the time. You can imagine 30,000 plant specimens is huge. Now Banks goes from nobody that you would have heard of to a footnote, to a paragraph, and now he's definitely running a chapter of a book, possibly two. He comes back to London and he is just fated. He and Solander are they're heroes of the scene. Cook, unfortunately, is forgotten about. And Banks then is presented to the king, George III, and he tells him all about the voyage, shows him the drawings and shows him the herbarium. And that's it. He is absolutely on top of the world. And you'd think that that would be it, but there's much more. In order to proceed academically in botany, you needed a herbarium because you needed to compare plants in order to work out where they fitted into the Linnaean order. All through Banks's life, a primary objective was to collect dried specimens for his herbarium. Now, that probably was the second largest herbarium in Britain. Certainly the largest private herbarium. The largest public herbarium was, of course, at the British Museum, and that was the Sloane Herbarium. And now, today, you can see both of them at the Natural History Museum.
So Banks himself didn't really introduce species into cultivation in Britain directly, but of course Banks was involved in the introduction of many species into cultivation indirectly, not least through his association with Kew Gardens. You can think of magnolias, species of magnolia or of fuchsia, tree peonies. You can think of the monkey puzzle tree. Many of those plants that we associate with English gardens today were introduced into Britain, in part through the efforts of Joseph Banks. Bringing back living plants from expeditions overseas was incredibly challenging. If you think of James Cook's circumnavigation, they travelled from the temperate realms in the south through the tropics and then back into the temperate zone again in the northern hemisphere. So great changes in environmental conditions. Of course, it would have been incredibly humid at times in the cabin, which would have increased problems with diseases and so on. And also, of course, there was a lot of salt, and plants don't like salt. So people trying to bring back living plants at that time were often not very successful. There was a very high mortality rate. So most living plants that were brought back as seeds that were then grown on, and then they could be examined later on when they grew and when they flowered. But of course, an important part of their collecting was collecting botanical specimens, pressed specimens with their reproductive parts and with their leaves that you could compare with specimens you already had to determine whether they were new species, how they fitted into the grand scheme of classification. The way they did this was by using bundles of paper in which they would place their specimens and then change those bundles periodically to remove the moisture until they were dry. And then they would keep their specimens in those bundles for the remainder of the voyage. And they collected something like 30,000 specimens during the course of that voyage. So it was a huge undertaking. So this is one of the bundles that Banks and Solander used to dry, to preserve, and then to keep their plants dry on the Endeavour voyage. Paper was expensive, and so you wouldn't want to use brand new paper. And so to make these bundles for drying their specimens, they used uncut pages from a book that had been published much earlier in the 1700s, a book entitled Notes upon the 12 Books of Paradise Lost, published by Joseph Addison, who was the founder of the Spectator. And what we can see in here today are some of the specimens that Banks and Solander collected. This is a specimen of Vaccinium, a species that occurs only in the island of Madeira. And this species was new to science. No one before had described this species from Madeira. So really significant collections. And what this really does, I think, is to give a tangible reminder of what they were doing on the boat, of the process of collecting, of drying, of documenting the remarkable collections that they made on that voyage. So Banks and Solander collected something like 30,000 specimens on the Endeavour voyage. It was a huge collecting effort. And many of those species were new to science. They hadn't previously been documented, described and named in that Linnaean system of nomenclature that we still use today. So those collections, all of those collections, are a hugely important scientific resource. Many of those collections were used by later scientists to actually name the species that they collected. So those are really important as type specimens. And those specimens collected by Banks and Solander are also a really important record of change through time. Every specimen is a record of a particular plant growing at a particular place at a particular time. And if you think of the profound changes that have happened over the last 250 years, that's a really important piece of evidence. So those collections provide us with evidence of change, of species that have changed in their distributions, and also of species that have gone extinct. So this is a volume of plants collected on Cook's first voyage, collected on the Endeavour voyage. And what it is, effectively, is a series of specimens collected from each of the localities at which they stopped, in Madeira, in Brazil, in Tierra del Fuego, in the Society Islands and in New Zealand. And on each page we find small representative specimens of the species that they collected at each of those stops. Beautifully pressed, beautifully presented, and each of them carefully labelled with their scientific name.
After the Endeavour, Banks began a London life, aside from a small voyage which he took, again with Solander, to Iceland in 1772. When that voyage was over in 1773, Banks never went to sea again, and then became a kind of a terrestrial naturalist as opposed to a traveling naturalist. Soon after that, he moved to Soho Square and got married and became president of the Royal Society, where his stellar career began. And so finally he was not just terrestrial, but settled. Meanwhile, what had happened is, because of the Endeavour, he had met George III. And George III was very interested in Banks's collection. What George III had was a private garden in a place that is still called Kew. But that garden in Kew is not the same as the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, although it's in the same place. But the main thing is that Banks now had a patron, and a patron who was interested in plants, in particular living plants, not interested in the herbarium. So Banks could foresee that while his traveling days were over, the collecting days weren't over. But now, in addition to the collecting of a herbarium for academic purposes, he could then satisfy the desires of the king to have a royal garden, and one that other princes and kings and queens in Europe had. So Banks could see that if he could somehow get collectors to do his work for him, he could ask them not just to collect dried specimens, but to collect living plants for him from the different parts of the world these people went to. Now, Banks was a powerful individual, and president of the Royal Society is not a small, position to have. But he didn't push himself into other people's path. When he tried to do that with the second Cook voyage, he got slapped in the face. And he learned that you have to manage friendships. You can't push yourself. You can't bully yourself, to use a more contemporary expression, into people's lives. And so from about 1773, when he effectively became Kew's, what he called a superintendent. He didn't have an occupational title. He didn't have a job description, but he knew that his patron wanted plants. So that as voyages came up, be they naval voyages or voyages particularly from the East India Company, which opened up the Pacific from the other side, Banks, if he was fortunate, could place a collector on those ships who would be collecting for both the King and for Soho Square.
So we can think of Banks as a collector in two separate ways. Banks was a collector of plants in the field. He would go out into the field, he would collect specimens, he would press them, dry them, so that he could bring them back to the herbarium and compare them with specimens that had been collected earlier. But we can also think of Banks as a collector of collections made by other individuals, and that's a really important part of Banks's botanical collecting. So Banks was acquiring specimens that were collected by individuals such as plant collectors. Francis Masson, who was sent out as the first plant collector of Kew Gardens, he sent specimens to Banks and they were incorporated into Banks's herbarium, his botanical collection. This is a strelitzia, a bird of paradise flower, that Masson sent to Joseph Banks during his visit to South Africa in the early 1700s. Masson would send specimens to Banks, and at the same time he would send seeds to William Ayton at Kew Gardens. Ayton was the head gardener at Kew, and Ayton would cultivate those seeds. And so what we see here, next to this specimen collected by Masson in South Africa, is a specimen that was cultivated at Kew Gardens and that flowered something like 17 years after it was first grown at Kew Gardens. And this is a specimen made from the plant that was growing at Kew. So we have the plant collected by Masson and the plant, a specimen that was made from a seed sent by Masson and cultivated at Kew. Banks was getting specimens sent to him from naval expeditions and from other trips overseas, such as the Macartney Embassy to China in the 1790s, the main focus of which was to develop trade links with China, but through Banks's influence, he was able to make sure that they also collected botanical specimens that came to him. Banks also used his wealth to acquire important collections. This, for example, is a sheet of crocuses from the herbarium of George Clifford. Clifford was an Anglo-Dutch banker. He owned a large garden in Haarlem, and he employed Carl Linnaeus to catalogue his plants in the 1730s. And consequently, the specimens in Clifford's herbarium were particularly important for the naming of plants in Linnaeus's binomial system of nomenclature, a system that we still use today. So these were really important specimens for understanding and documenting and naming the plant diversity of the planet. Banks realised that, and when the opportunity came for him to purchase them, he did.
For Banks, really plants from anywhere in the world were just fine. But there was one part of the world that he was desperate to get plants from, and that was China. Now, it so turned out that in 1792, or possibly right at the very end of 1791, Banks picked up, let's call it a rumor, that the British were planning a diplomatic mission to the imperial court in Beijing. And remember, nobody had mentioned science. This was a diplomatic mission. But Banks could see that it was a bit like the Endeavour, we're going to push this a little further. So he had convinced Macartney and his secretary, whose name was George Staunton, that they should have room for scientific inquiry in this, and by which Banks meant botany. Unfortunately for Banks, the people who were paying the bills was the East India Company, who had most to gain from this. Because remember, the diplomatic mission was not about diplomacy, it was about trade. And the trade was run by the East India Company on behalf of the British Crown. So Banks thought that the only solution to this is to turn Staunton, who had a scientific bent, into a plant collector. So he had to educate Staunton and anyone else who wanted to join him about Chinese plants. So what Banks did is he produced a kind of a set of instructions as to which plants he wanted. And we have at the Linnaean Society that very set of instructions. So this document provides the list of Banks's most wanted plants. So this is an example of how Banks picked out a particular plant. And here is the tree peony, called in Chinese mouton. And there's a description of it and why he wants it. Banks also states that it's important to produce drawings of the plants that they collect. And in here, Banks has produced a very beautiful drawing in the process of being completed, so that they can work out exactly how to do it, to draw the outline and then start coloring it in, and incredibly naturalistic. And you can see that it has to have its complete botanical livery down here. So what it looks like at every stage of growth.
So Banks has been called many things: dictator of British botany, autocrat of the philosophers, centre of calculation. And I think all of those tend to reflect the fact that Banks was a key figure in the development of British botany, British natural history. But it's interesting to think of how Banks thought of himself. And he described himself as a projector. He was someone who was involved in many projects, and projects that were global in their extent. And I think people who have evaluated Banks more recently have come to realise two things. First of all, the extent to which Banks relied on many individuals' expertise to actually successfully deliver those projects. And secondly, the fact that Banks's great skill really was as a facilitator and a connector to be able to deliver those projects. So if there was a sort of an agenda, perhaps it wasn't as clear cut as some of those titles that have been used, or some of those phrases that have been used to refer to Banks might have suggested.
Now Banks has been, and I think incorrectly seen, as quite a coercive, manipulative, almost dictatorial or autocratic type. And when I began my research, that's exactly what I came into my research with. But every time I read a letter, every time I came across him, this picture just began dissolving and dissolving and dissolving, until it was replaced by a much nicer person, more amiable, somebody you'd like to go out to dinner with, somebody that you could call a friend. What's important about Banks, not only in his lifetime but afterwards, is that he was a great believer in the sharing of knowledge. His house and his home in Soho Square, which had his library and his herbarium, became open very soon after he moved into it to scholars from all over the world, whoever came by who wanted to study in his amazing collection. So it wasn't so much Banks himself, but the resources he offered up to the world of scholarship that became his legacy, because these people, botanists, would go back to their own countries and continue this legacy of the importance of botany, the importance of Linnaean botany, and the importance of keeping this science going and seeing where it went. So One of the places it went is into the scientific study of plants, so plant pathology, plant diseases, plant growth, finally plant genetics, and all the way to the present. And also through the gardening side, horticultural side. And that became a very big part of Banks's life, the horticultural, because he had his own garden in his own private country estate. So he would try out his horticultural experiments in his own garden and would invite scientists who were interested in horticulture there rather than Soho Square. So in fact he had three sides. There was Kew, which was the King's Garden, which was all about growing plants. Then there was Soho Square and the herbarium and the endless texts and drawings and everything else in all kinds of languages. And then the horticultural scene in a place called Spring Grove. And during Banks's lifetime, all three were dynamic centers of learning.